Holocaust. They're about the effect of the Holocaust upon either survivors, like Song of Names, or about the woman who had the facial surgery, Phoenix, and many others that we've seen. Those Who Remained, about the young girl and the doctor, both damaged by losing relatives, and how they cope post-war. But those tend to be more current. This film was made in 1989. And my respect for it grew. Not that Mazursky was a Jewish slouch in his filmmaking. And it was a well-known book by Isaac Bashevis Singer. I have to admit, I never read one of his books, but I did get a copy of this and I started reading it. Didn't finish it, but it's also not near my desk. But if I can, I'll find a great quote from it. But certainly Singer wrote a lot about the effects of the Holocaust upon survivors and their relatives. And I was surprised that a film that had this much awareness was made in 1989, but that's who Mazursky was. He was a filmmaker with a conscience. He did a lot of commercial comedies. You may remember Bob and Carol and Ted and Alice, The Pickle, Scenes from a Mall. What else has he done?
The Tempest.
Tempest, right? He acted in a lot of films. You've probably seen
Unmarried Woman.
Stop Greenwich Village, I think is his.
Right. Down and Out in Beverly Hills, and many others. I mean, we've named quite a few. He was very prolific in the An Unmarried Woman with, I think, Jill Clayburgh, and was very prolific in the 70s and 80s. Moscow on the Hudson, which I think is one of Fern's favorite films. Is that right?
I love all of Mazursky's films.
So he really touches a nerve, even if he, it's not astonishing style or anything, but there's an honesty, a genuine authenticity that rings true with most people. And this one did for me. So this film, I came to it after not realizing that it's actually a study in 4 different types of Holocaust survivors. And that's pretty remarkable to do so well in one film. And I think it's the Singer's credit that he could put all that in one book, because as I started reading the book, I recognized lines from the movie. So I'm sure they hewed very closely to the book. And if anybody else is familiar with it, please chime in. But there is this knowledge of what it was like in the late 40s, early 50s to be in New York, living among a lot of survivors. Similarly, those longtime LA residents know there were many survivors who were assigned or chose to come live in Los Angeles too. And we're losing them now as we are losing survivors everywhere. But I believe the figure was 25,000 or more were living in LA at one point. And certainly their children, such as Fern, are with us. And
we grew up initially, I lived in New York. My parents were survivors and all of their friends were survivors. And a lot of the story is very, very familiar to me, including the plot of somebody who's stuck with 2 wives.
Uh-huh. And this guy was stuck with 3 because the third came back from the dead. I mean, I don't know if you knew any, obviously it must have happened occasionally.
It did.
But Singer just kind of pulled it all together. A friend of mine, whose father was a well-known agent in Hollywood, went in search of his sweetheart, and they were separated by the war. I believe they were each in camps. And one of them had written their name on what was left of a wall of one of their homes. And the other came by and saw it, I'm alive, I'm here.
Wow. Aww.
And they eventually found each other and married. And they actually did a This Is Your Life on them, which you can look up online. The book is called Walter and Hannah, Walter Kohner and his wife Hannah.
Wrote Gidget.
Excuse me, Fern?
I think he wrote Gidget.
I don't know that he wrote it, but he certainly was involved in it or as a producer. He and his brother were Hollywood players as agents. And for many decades after, the Kohner Agency had an office on Sunset Boulevard on the Strip. So it's common. And the fact that people came together after the survivors came together in such dramatic ways is understandable. We'll come back to it, but one interesting insight was the suicide rate among survivors. I've met many survivors who have led spectacular lives, and you wonder where their optimism and their faith in humanity and their love for other people and their willingness to do good is astonishing. And you wonder, how could they survive from such horrible circumstances where they saw such cruelty and be optimistic? And to many of them, it's like, well, that was the only alternative. And we think back to Viktor Frankl's book, where he was a Holocaust survivor, and he didn't choose, and a psychiatrist, and he didn't choose to study those who died. He looked for signs of what did the people who survived the camps, what were they made of? What were their strategies for surviving? And it's that will to live, that optimism, hopefulness. I am better than this, even though it's oppressive. Now, we have examples of people here who, and I want to run down their personalities. Jadwiga, who is wonderful performance. And how do you play stupid intelligently? You know, this actor really did, and brought together all the simplicity and then the raw emotion and passion of that role. Wasn't even Jewish, but there were many non-Jewish survivors, not just the gypsies and the gays and the communists. You know, there were people who got caught literally in the crossfire, or who lost family or lost their homes. And in a way, they were just as displaced and just as much prone to post-traumatic stress as somebody in the camps. Different, of course, but they were damaged in other ways. As we saw in the film, Those Who Remained, the doctor was never in a camp, but he lost his wife and 2 sons in a camp somehow. The young girl whom he nurtures lost her parents, but couldn't cope with that reality and kept writing letters to them years after the war ended. She thought they were somewhere in Sweden. So it affects everybody very differently. But Jadwiga responded, and in many ways it comes back to haunt her, with optimism. I mean, she was the servant of the family and felt very loyal, as many did. The cartoonist whose work I have profiled had a Polish housemaid who took care of him and his retarded brother. And his wife, his mother, remained in Lodz, and the housekeeper stayed with her, and they both went off to Chelmna, where they died. And that woman was not even Jewish, but she had such a loyalty to the family. So that's her story. And of course, serving him and having lost her own sight of her own family, of course she loves him. And I want to point to a very early description of Herman in the book, where Singer says, and Herman says this too, he doesn't know who he is anymore. So much has happened to him. And if I can run away from my desk, I'll find that. But Singer had he's a great storyteller. And of course, that makes for the spine of a really good film. And clearly, I think Herman starts off as a really good guy, instead of being kind of a mess at the end, because he seems to love Jadwiga. He knows she's kind of simple. He has a mistress, but he's devoted to her as well, because why? She helped her uncle house them when they were running from the Nazis, and she saved his family. And that's a kind of obligation that many people assumed. I don't know if you all have any stories like that, but that's pretty profound. You know, in some cultures, you saved my life, therefore I owe you mine. And that's the kind of indebtedness that Herman really felt in the beginning, and seemed kind of happy, you know, as long as he could go off to Masha. And why he consented to marry Jadwiga. So that's Jadwiga's story. Masha's story, we learn in bits and pieces that she was in a camp, that all the Nazi guards wanted her, but she said no, she couldn't do that. And I think she's a fascinating character. She's the most electric and alive, and he says she's crazy and terribly interesting, or fascinating is how Herman describes her. And she is. She is the brightest light in the room. She's also the most troubled. And I want to jog your memories. There's some pretty steamy sex scenes in there, not by today's standards, but every time they have sex or the subject of sex comes up, so does the subject of death. You know, should we die together? Right? What would you do if I died? How long would it take you to find another woman? These things happen throughout the whole film. And this is not sex for sex's sake. It may seem like it with Lena, but Faith Kinsler, who was a psychologist and counseled senior survivors until she herself passed away about 5 years ago, she told me that in the displaced persons camp, and oh, Jeff, you're there. Hi, Jeff. Maybe you can chime in on this. In the DP camps after the war, there was a huge population explosion. People couldn't wait to hook up and start a family. You know, the best revenge is surviving, and that's a marker of being alive. And I think for Masha, the notion of intimate sex with somebody, the undeniability of it, told her that she was no longer under a body of corpses. Sorry, that was Tamara. I'm confusing my survivors. That was her way out. You know, that intensity. It wasn't hedonism for her, it was connection, because she was so damaged. And of course, she takes things to an extreme at the end, and he can't, because he's not that dramatic a personality. But some people were just more vulnerable and more dramatic about how damaged they were, that they did take their own lives. And in researching the film, I found that women were 3 times more likely than male survivors to commit suicide. And they don't exactly know why, not enough studies have been done, but they committed suicide far ahead of the males and far ahead of women in American society, or European society even. And to me, I suspect it's like Tamara, who lost 2 children, or the doctor even who lost 2 children. When you lose children in the Holocaust, it's so damaging. What is there left to live for? And there's a point, when they go off to the Catskills, to Kretschmer's, and after they have sex, they're lolling around together. And he said, "Did you marry anybody? You know, or did you see anybody?" She said, "Yes, but I never married." Why? Because after all I've been through, what's marriage? You know, it's trivial. It's like, and she yells at her mother once, "That's your bourgeois convention. Why do you saddle us all with it?" That goes along with the differences. Tamara was a Trotskyite, but a little bit of that filters into Masha. So that kind of fatalism crops up it's throughout Masha's character in the film. If you ever see it again, you see signs of this deep disturbance in her, almost an outsider looking in at her own life, at her own pain, in a very fatalistic way, until she sees no other way out. And then there's Tamara, Angelica Houston, who is a great performance. You expect her to throw herself at him. In many ways, she's the wisest one of the bunch, wiser than her uncle, wiser than Herman for sure. She doesn't expect anything. It would be great, right, if they got back together, but she is the manager. She becomes the mother hen and the person who has somehow been able to secure her for herself an awareness that is not suicidal. Sure, she'd like to be together with him or someone else again, and she will always live with the memory of her 2 children, but somehow she's learned to embrace life. And I'll cut to the chase so nobody else does. That's the meaning of the last scene. It ends on the infant, doesn't it? And then the wheel, the wonder wheel, the great Mandela, of being alive and seeing the next generation come. It's a very touching ending. And the other characters are kind of peripheral. We can excuse Alan King because he's Alan King after all. Probably the worst rabbi you've ever known or met. I hope he is. And because he's Alan King, he's not a rabbi, but I forgive Mazursky. It was a thing. Remember, this film was made in 1989 when I guess King had some star power. I forgot to, Zachary Seth is joining us again. Welcome, Zach. Haven't seen you in years, but you're always welcome back. You know, the mother is a stereotypical mother, and the owner of the nursing homes who has lots of money, and Mrs. Shiner. You know, it's okay that these people are stereotypes. The women who frown on Herman as he walks by on the street, you know, because Jadwiga is such a sweet woman, and they know he's having an affair somehow. So that I think that's the rundown of the characters. If you have any other simple observations about them, if you saw them in a different way, please speak up. I'd love to hear from Jeff Ellison about post-Holocaust life in the camps or out of the camps, or many of these survivors were 30 and 40 years old and very vital if they survived. So can you chime in, Jeff?
I really don't have that much to add to what you were saying. I mean, certainly the DP camps did have the highest birth rate in the world at the time after liberation. I really can't add that much to what you were describing there. So I'm curious how other people viewed the film. I was a little confused at the beginning when it's the Nazis catch him. We don't really get their stories. I mean,
right.
They're full stories. We know that they experienced terrible trauma, but we don't exactly know what they went through during the Holocaust. So I was just kind of wondering about that. But I'll just leave it there.
We can talk about that. I mean, it is decidedly not a film about what happened in the Holocaust.
Right.
The decision Mazursky made and Singer made in his book is really focusing and drilling down into what makes these people run. You know, it's like, it doesn't matter what they're running from. We all know the horrors. Let's see how it manifests itself in them. And that's more interesting than any view of the camps or the suitcases they carry or the gas chambers. I think that's what's in play here, that you don't need to know their backstories, to understand the present tense stories.
I'd be very curious how survivors reacted to seeing this film, because you know, there isn't, they're all damaged, incredibly damaged here. But there were survivors, obviously, who went on and rebuilt their lives and families, and we don't see any of those that character and of those people, and I just wonder how they would feel about the film. So,
well, I wonder too, but I think, like Fern said, it would probably ring true to them, because even those who built successful lives probably knew people like this who were so damaged they couldn't live a normal life.
I have a few comments to make, but I like to call on people who have their hands up first. I think that Doris and Steve Miller, Doris, Susie, and Iris.
I thought it was interesting. Every place he went, they were feeding him. He was being fed every place. They just inundated him with food no matter where he went. I thought that was so interesting. He never seemed to get his fill because he was always eating somewhere. Somebody was always making a lot of wonderful food for him, you know.
Well, that's the survivor thing, you know.
I thought that was interesting.
We'll never be hungry again.
Yeah,
It's a message
yeah.
that carries with it.
Steve Miller? Did we lose you? Hold on.
No, Mona decided she didn't need to add anything.
Okay. All righty, Susie. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself, Susie.
You, okay, here I come. It was an absolutely wonderful film. You eclipse yourself with each one of our classes, Jim. Each film gets better than the one before, and this one was really good. There wasn't an actor in this film that didn't do a superb, believable job.
Mhm.
Absolutely so believable. And the guy that came in at the end that was going to publish his books or something, that guy was terrific. He had a small part, but oh my goodness, he was good. And speaking of Herman, I was very, very confused as to what his profession was, that he could get away with going to Pittsburgh and Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and God in California.
Indiana. Okay, so
and-
let me ask you a question.
Just a minute, was he a translator? Was he a scribe for the rabbi?
He was writing a book with the rabbi and writing speeches for him. And let me ask you this: why did he tell those stories? It's because Jadwiga bought them. That he was successful with her because she didn't bother to think about where he was really going. She was so thrilled to be in America. He was her savior from Europe, probably lost her own family members. So she was blinded by how improved her life was, but couldn't see his betrayal.
And what was his job?
He sold books. He was a publisher in Europe. So it was easy for him to claim that.
I see.
But I think the income mostly came from the rabbi's employment, which is why he always jumped and ran, you know, for the
And
rabbi.
what was he doing for the rabbi?
He was writing sermons and co-writing a book.
Really? With the rabbi's name? He was the ghostwriter.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the guy, a rabbi who wears a white suit and has, you know, is redecorating his apartment all the time, and, you know, gets crushes on all the hot women in his congregation or who come near him. I mean, he's a real character.
Definitely.
You know, of course, Alan King did not underplay it,
No,
but
he did a great job.
you know, and he's one of these gushy Jews. Excuse me, again, a cliche for post-war. He said, "How come you won't accept my friendship? I could do great things for you." As you know,
Right.
he's leaving. You know, and it's like I'm the fixer. Come to me. You know, I'm a political operative. Meet the richest man in town who has 100 nursing homes. I only have one in Florida and one in California. It's like there are all these jabs at Jewish cliches, you know, that they're making. I don't know if they're in the book or not, but it's like that's Mazursky. He's a jokey, you know, many of his films are comedic, and he loves a good laugh occasionally. And this was 1989 when a lot of those laughs weren't so tired as they might, you know, strike us today, you know, as being too stereotyped. So
Well,
that's my answer to why, how do you get away with it? Because, you know, Jadwiga allowed him to, and Masha allowed him to, and Tamara could see right through him and allowed him to, because she had no expectation. You know, it's like Masha says, after all I've been through, do I really care about anything? You know, he was her last connection to life, you know. And again, it wasn't about the sex per se, it was about the connection.
mhm.
Certainly her mother was, you know, annoying, but of course when her mother dies, she won't leave, you know, at the end there.
Mhm.
He wants to be buried next to her mother. And he even says, well, come to California, you can be buried with me. No. So, you know, these people are still who they are. We don't have to know all about what made them. We just have to feel what they feel when they feel it in front of us. And for you, it was obviously successful.
Very.
So Iris, Gail, LaDonna, and Frank.
So, Jim, you always get to the point I wanted to make just before I want.
Well, maybe you can say it better than I, so say it again.
Well, you were talking about the relationship between Masha and her mother, and I
Yeah.
thought that was kind of remarkable all through the movie. The mother kind of represented, somehow retained that conventionality of motherhood, telling the daughter how she should live, but allowing her to do every darn thing she wants to do anyway. And the closeness of that relationship between her and her mother at the end, when the mom dies and she just cannot leave her, just struck me as a result of her experiences in the war. And that was what tied her to her mother after her mother's death.
There's a scene early on when she lashes out at her mother many times in the film.
Right.
And it's like she's bipolar almost. This love-hate relationship.
Right.
And that's the only relationship she has that she can behave that way. She's just amazingly. That relationship in the movie was very impressive to me. But what I also wanted to say is, you said about Alan King and his portrayal of, did you ever see a worse rabbi? There was a worse rabbi in A Serious Man. I thought he was the worst, so you could look at that one.
Okay, we'll have dueling worst rabbi stories.
I know.
But I want to stay on this because you bring up something important about Masha, in that this duality, and she turns on a dime at the very end when she's pounding on the bathroom door because he's sick, because he was outed for having 3 wives. There's love and there's hate simultaneously, and I unfortunately have some relatives who are in that kind of relationship, and it's like hate is confused with love because it's so intense in emotion, and you know, we only hurt the ones we love, and that's how you can, because it's so deep into you, into how you're wired, and you know, the affronts go deeper, and the affection goes deep. So it's it's a demonstration of her volatility, that early scene. But again, she's very consistent throughout the movie, and I had forgotten that she kills herself at the end when I saw it this time 2 weeks ago, and but it's there. It's all over the picture. You feel it coming. I think the Reiners are next.
No, Gail, LaDonna, and then Frank.
So I wanted to comment because I have read some of Singer, and I thought that the film really rang true to how he wrote, how he writes. And one of his strengths, I believe, is his ability to describe a woman. And sometimes Singer doesn't, when you read it, you think, aha, he's sexist from our perspective today. But I think that he has an idea about how to portray a woman. And I thought that was very evident in his portrayal of the women in this film. And I think if we would read the short story, we would probably have that same feeling about him.
Yeah, thank you for that. In it's a novel that I read, I was amazed. I knew he was a simple writer. I don't mean that derogatorily, but it was very direct and in plain language. But his observations of people were astonishingly on point. And it's like you didn't need a backstory when he told you this thing about that person, you know, you believed it all. You know, it was like it was there in the present, as though you witnessed it yourself. And that's a real gift. And I think that's part of the authenticity of the piece and of his work overall. Who's next?
And next is LaDonna, and then Frank, and then Susie.
I just wanted to say, Miss Jim, you always pick wonderful movies. And welcome back, Vern. And I think in this film, there's a lot of different, it's like a diamond. You see everything from a different perspective on the role that people play. But Angelica Houston, amazing. She's a great performance. I want to thank you for the film. And one other comment, when people survive and they have hope with love like I get from Wilshire Boulevard Temple and my relatives, my adult kids, they inspire me. I just got to audition for a Kelly Clarkson show, and I wore lavender and purple, and the whole set Universal, everything was in the color of the dress I was wearing. It's because of Wilshire Boulevard Temple. And I just want to say thank you to everybody. We'll see what happens. And thank you for showing the film.
Okay, well, good luck with your audition.
Thank you, LaDonna. Frank?
Yes, I found this very tragic, sad movie. Yet, and I feeling that way, I'm confused. From the very start with the music in the background. It's kind of like a pop, a Jewish comedy kind of thing, right, with the klezmer kind of gay, delightful, merry music. And even at the end and throughout, and while the Alan King character is comedic, so exaggerated, but other than that, I'm confused by it, by how it's presented totally.
The music was too light and should have been more somber or serious at times.
Well, that's my feeling. I think that what was the intent here to leave you with a light feeling, with a comedic feeling, with a what, or was it the effect on me was sad of these damaged lives and the pathos that they have gone through. It just doesn't fit with how it was presented.
I'd like to address that because I think it fits kind of with how I saw my family and all the other survivors. I think that the people who survived were both extraordinary. Everybody who went through that to different degrees, depending on their experiences, was damaged. You could not go through that without being damaged. And depending on what happened, if you were in a camp or you were in a ghetto or you lost a child or you were in hiding, the degree of damage varied, but you were going to be damaged. At the same time, the people who survived most of them were the strongest of the strong, the most resilient. And they were people who were able, often after the war, to deal with both the damage and the sadness in their lives and remain extraordinarily vital. My parents and their friends were people who celebrated all the time. They celebrated everything. Mm-hmm. They celebrated if I got an A on a test. They celebrated, a good week. And during the war, they engaged in life-affirming activities as much as possible, even though it seems contrary to what was going on. My father was hiding in a sewer for the last year of the war. And I know, they were in a sewer and with 32 other people.
Is this in Warsaw?
In Warsaw. They remained in the city. There was no food. There was nothing. They were in these steamy, filthy sewers. He came out of the war almost a dead person from starvation, but they were having sex in that sewer.
If I may, Fern, you didn't respond. I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't answer my question.
The music
they may celebrate, but the merriment background of the music and how it
was not simply merriment. It was merriment. It was nostalgia. It was sexy. It was all of those things. It was complicated, and they were complicated, and the music in the movie was complicated, and it reflected all of that.
Yeah,
and
Frank, I think if you watched it again, you'd see that the jokiness of the music diminishes as we go through it, as it gets more serious. But I think this may go
I'm sorry. In the credits at the end, it's there. It's not sad music at the end. It's gay.
It was very
delightful klezmer music.
It was very varied, as was their emotional inner and outer lives. Okay. I watched this movie twice today.
Okay. All right,
Okay.
I'll accept your thoughts.
But no, Frank, now let's stay with this because this is important how we perceive things. At the end of the movie, we have Tamara and Jadwiga with the child. And
Yeah.
wasn't that an uplifting thing for you?
Yes, until I realized that, you know, that he's no longer around, and this is the remnants of what was, and survivors of it, they're survivors again.
That's
They
right.
survived.
Well, but
Over and over and over. Life demands it of them,
Right,
and
right.
they did that.
And,
Yeah.
and the music ties into that, that there is, despite all this pain that we've witnessed, there's some joy that's still possible as the look at the child, you know.
And-
That's what that means.
And I think that the fact that everybody was having, you know, he was having sex with a lot of people and everybody was making love, all of this, that was happening. My mother was a slave on a farm in Germany. They were having sex. I mean, it was a way of affirming you were still alive.
Right.
Yeah.
And they weren't all that guilty about it, by the way, any more than, you know, Angelica Houston's character was all that angry about it. Everybody did what they could to be alive.
Right. After what I've been through, what does it matter? Or this is not a big deal, you know.
Right.
Marriage is just a bourgeois institution.
So there's some, I think that there's a few people who haven't spoken who wanted to speak now. The Seagulls and Miriam next, and then Natalie.
Steve, I think you got called.
Oh, okay.
Oh, I'm sorry, Steve first. Yep.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. It's funny because about 20 minutes ago, I wanted to say a few words in defense of Alan King. And if you ever want to see a great performance by him, if such a thing is possible, take a look at a movie called Just Tell Me What You Want. It's a brilliant comedy. But Alan King always plays Alan King playing a character. And Mussorgsky is a satirist at heart. And he deliberately cast him. And it made me think that with the cap teeth and all, but it made me realize, or it reminded me how much humor there is in this movie. And I think some of the use of the music is an irony or a contrast to all the pathos. I remember the scene in particular where Herman was skulking in the rowboat and Masha had to row him away. It's low comedy or farcical. Or at the end when he's at that party and he's dodging the publisher who wants to publish his books, who is a famous character actor who's about 4'9". And I think he played Woody Allen's agent in a movie. But there's a lot of dark humor threaded throughout this movie too, and it's not the pawnbroker.
Right. Right. There's plenty when Herman has his flashbacks. I thought these were particularly well handled because we only really saw the scene in the barn. The rest is in his mind. He's looking at two plants in front of the hotel and he hears the dogs barking. And it's like, and the horror is on his face because it's in his head.
Right.
So they don't, you know, the problem with reenactments is that they always look fake. So if you can, one thing to look for in a reenactment is if the director decides not to show the faces, but he shows the feet or the hands or something else. That's a very clever way of directing your attention away from the authenticity to the comment the flashback is meant to carry, right? So you're not judged because all you see are the feet. Well, are the shoes period appropriate? You know, but if somebody's performing and talking, then you can criticize the performance or the likeness or the speech, and you're watching instead of being engaged. Whereas this sort of eliminates the outside stimuli and allows the film to carry itself, you know, inside the person, and you get the horror of or the meaning of the flashback to the person who's having it.
Gail Siegel, you want to unmute yourself?
Well, I thought I would say something about Tamara. She was so typical of how survivors can just change and do things just to keep going. How when we first saw her, she was at the Judaica shop. And then she decided to manage Herman, which didn't seem to go very well. And then she took over helping with the baby and seemed very satisfied in doing that. And knowing how she escaped from the Nazis was very interesting. I've known people who have been in similar situations and they just made it. And with that energy and forward-looking part of their lives, they managed to make a new life. It's a wonderful quality. He portrayed it very well.
Thank you. Miriam.
I think let's say I agree with you, Gail. Tamara, I think, expressed to us a person that had gone through horror and beyond horror and practically indescribable kind of situations where, of course, no one can place themselves in a situation of being in a pit with corpses and being alive. And yet, she perhaps was, to me, the example of an evolved woman that was able to get over herself, get over her circle of egocentrism, and become what Judaism asks of you, and that is to do for others. And at the end, it was so natural for her to be with this abandoned widow abandoned wife with a new baby, and to be there. She's probably living with her and helping her take care of a new child, which is a very daunting and challenging situation to be in. And I thought to myself, where is our hero? Where is he? Does everybody know where he is except me?
No, where is he? Tell us, because I think that's left unsaid.
I don't know where he is.
You don't. Well, he's a
And
dead.
is it for us to guess where he could be? Or are
Probably
we?
California. He did pack a suitcase when he goes to Masha's apartment.
He's
but
just not there.
Yeah.
He's anywhere but with her. It was just too much for him to do. He wasn't a bad guy. He was a weak person ultimately.
He was no, excuse me, Fern. He was beyond weak. This is a man who just became a father. There are a huge amount of men in his position who, for whatever reasons, are not fathers. They haven't been able to become a father. The life didn't deal them that kind of thing where they would be a father. So many men would want to do anything to become a father. And here he was blessed with a baby that he had no desire to see because he couldn't get over himself. I say that in almost a literal thing.
Or
He
the
couldn't.
death of his two children.
What?
He lost two previous children. He couldn't get over that.
Okay, well, that helps explain it a little bit better then.
It's a very good point, Miriam, but it's also, he says, I'm a mess. I just don't know what to do late in the picture. And in thinking back to when I saw this first 2 years ago, I said, he can't decide anything. That's not enough of a movie for me, because I was looking at the wrong thing in the movie. And I think Mazursky has a keener eye for the women, as does Singer, that they just, there was more there for in the women's roles. He was just a foil, and so I can't explain where he is. I just, he couldn't make it, but the women could.
Well, I don't know if he was such a foil, excuse me, Jim, because he had a choice not to marry Masha. in the temple or wherever they were
He
married?
thought she was
Because he
fine.
was a married man already.
Okay, but-
Therefore, he had a choice not to. Now, I didn't know you're allowed to get married twice in the United States. I thought it was against the
Well, no,
law.
it's a religious thing because it wasn't a religious ceremony when he married Jadwiga. And he thought, and the uncle, Tamara's uncle explains it all. Well, you know, Tamara is okay. You honestly thought she was dead. And the first one, you still thought you were a single man. The mistress is something else. He doesn't know about the mistress yet. But you underestimating the power that Masha had over him. You know, perhaps the passion that he felt for her is ignited by her volatility and her dynamism and her seeming to want to devour him too. He didn't have that with the other women. And Jadwiga is more a guilty obligation to be good to this person who saved his life and to the family that saved his life. And he's getting knowing Masha the way he did made him turn away from Jadwiga. So you can say he's a scoundrel. But he went with a more exciting possibility. And, you know, and he married her because he thought she was pregnant, you see. So it's like, I wouldn't be too hard on him. He's just kind of a nebbish at the end. He's so conflicted out of any decision, even though his head was turned away from Jadwiga to Masha and doesn't get turned towards Tamara.
Masha always knew she was not pregnant, or did she actually think she was pregnant?
Well, we don't know about her. She says a lot. Like, remember, she says, well, I promised and I didn't mean it. Right? She's a slippery character, you know, as super dynamic people often are. And she's sort of obsessed with self and her own pain. Right. And it's like she's his boy, not his boy toy, but her lifesaver. And she can't live without him, which is why she's always talking about, let's die together. And, you can't expect the same logic from her that you can of the other two.
So Susie, Steve Miller, Jeff, and Iris.
Am I muted?
No.
Okay, here I go. This is quick. I wonder if it bothered anybody the way it did me. The scene that he's got the tablecloth over his head or something.
The talus.
And the talus over his head. And he's diligently, dramatically reading the Torah. And his sweet, loving, caring wife is there. I don't know what it was that upset him because I couldn't tell what she said. And he slaps her, totally slaps her and walks out the door.
Yeah, I forget the moment, but
No, he didn't walk out the door. He slapped her, and then she told him, how could you do this? I saved your life. I gave you food. I cleaned up after you. I gave you the food out of my mouth. And he remembers what he owes her, and he stops at that moment. He stops and he understands that kind of pulsating loyalty you have to somebody who has saved your life.
What motivated him? First of all, I want to know why he was reading the Torah with the talus.
That's an easy one.
What motivated him? What you think motivated him to slap her?
I don't remember the moment, but I can tell you that people often turn towards extreme ritualistic expressions of a religion when they're down and out, because they're desperate for to give their lives some shape and some meaning. It's a good thing and it's a bad thing.
That was a scene after he refused to go to synagogue on Yom Kippur.
That's right. Well,
so
an inconsistency.
Definitely.
it was.
He was a very, very confused guy.
Nadine, I'm sorry. Natalie, I think we skipped over you. Go ahead.
Yeah,
Natalie.
well, just what Susie was saying, if I remember that correctly, he was so angry with God. He was so angry with the religion that brought all this down on himself and everybody he loved, his wife, his children. And here this wife who isn't Jewish, who's taken on this new religion, is so religious and so into all of this God, who at this time, there is no way he believes in any God for himself. That's what I think why he slapped her, if I remember that correctly. But what I had wanted to say was that I agreed with every single thing that Fern said. And to add to that was that every character, the way we're trying to analyze them in our own logical way, every one of them, they were mentally ill. They were sick in many ways from the horrors of what they saw and what had happened to them during the war. I don't think any of us could ever put ourselves, you can't even know how they felt. So every single one of those characters, when she started screaming, when they got so excited, was just an example of how tortured they had been. And the scene where the old mother says, "Oh, I wanted a baby." Do you remember that in the movie?
Yeah.
I wanted my daughter, because then there would be one more to take the place of all those that they killed.
Rename the people.
Yes.
Yes.
And so at the end of the movie, it was perfect for me when this baby is born.
And they named it Masha, by the way. They named the baby Masha.
Yeah, well, but here was this new life that had not been damaged like all the characters in this movie. And look how excited those two women were going to treasure this new baby, because that was the whole point, that life was just taken away, brutalized during the war, that the only way we can get back to that is to create more of us to continue on.
Mm-hmm.
So I love the movie, by the way, so that's it.
So Steve Miller, Jeff, Iris, Lisa, did you have your hand up or you just?
Arlene too.
Okay.
It's actually Mona.
Okay, Mona. Then
Okay,
Iris, then Jeff, then Iris.
I actually thought that some of the problems with Herman, the male character played by Ron Silver, were from Ron Silver's acting. I thought he was inconsistent. I thought that his performance lacked the undercurrent of sorrow and anguish that Angelica Houston presented so brilliantly. I thought what Angelica Houston pulled off was she was sending this shell of a person out into the world. And in the very first scene where she's introduced, she points out, "Oh, they colored my hair, I put on makeup, I did my nails." She sort of gives her, she reviews herself and then says, "But I'm not alive." She realizes that something profound in her is completely gone forever. And he never presented, I was so disappointed in his performance, because yes, he's a feckless, weak, confused guy. But if that same performance had been infused with a sense of underlying loss and sorrow and tragedy throughout, it's like when he kissed the photograph of his children. I didn't believe it. I thought you've had the whole movie to show me that this was going on, and you didn't do that. So it was too late for me at that point for that performance to be redeemed. So I thought it was lacking.
Mona, don't you think it may be that he was a feckless guy, that you're suggesting that if he had acted better, he would have perhaps been less feckless? But I think the point is that he was a weak guy.
But it's one.
I mean, somebody who leaves ultimately, regardless of his experiences, is a bigger mess than other people.
I think what Mona's saying what Mona is saying is that if he had been more dynamic and had been able to show his own torment and pain, it would have been a much better film, because then we would have watched another person get destroyed as a consequence.
But what I'm saying is maybe he needed not to be that, or he wouldn't have left. That the kind of guy who would have left is not what you're describing.
Yeah, that's quite possible, Fern. I agree with that. The other thing is that I think he's lost all faith. There is no God. He's sitting there reading the Torah and trying to present to this Polish housemaid what Judaism is all about. And the moments that I found the most hilarious were when Jadwiga is scared out of her mind or something horrible is happening, and she involuntarily crosses herself because that's how she was raised, and that's her way of protecting herself from whatever horror she's seeing. And it was absolutely hilarious, and I think that was the kind of thing that led him to slap her. And it's clear he treats her like a servant throughout the entire movie. Our first image of her is she's scrubbing the floor, and then she's scrubbing him in the bathtub, and he won't even put the damn newspaper down. You know, he lifts it up so she can do his armpit while he's in the tub. I mean, he clearly just treated her like the maid throughout. So he's worse than feckless. He's insensitive and a jerk, and it was hard for me to see what these different women saw in him.
He was good looking.
He was not a great lover.
No, I think, more importantly, he was there.
Yes, he was there.
And he was virile. He clearly could do it. I mean,
I love the love
that.
scene. Love the love scene. Oh God.
Okay, Jeff, Iris, and then Risa does have her hand up. And Arlene.
I'm just going to make a quick comment in the recent book, which is the about Holocaust cinema, a complete history. It puts this film in the category of comedy, along with films like Harold and Maude, and Jacob the Liar. So I think that there was, I can't remember who said it, but I think there was a tremendous amount of farce and a comedy in this, not ha-ha, rollicking, fun kind of comedy. But I do think that comedy kind of like was a contrast between the seriousness of what the film was about, and I thought it was really effective. And I felt when the character Ron Silvers, or he kissed the photographs of the children, I found that incredibly powerful. I found that it really explained a lot about him. It was in the top drawer of the dresser, and he takes it out and stares at it. And that's when we really grasp why he is the way that he is, that the impact of the death of these children was so powerful on him that he was lost. He was a lost soul. And finally, I thought, Tamar, I when we go back to that scene where she says she's dead, and the end of the film with the baby, and we see the kind of joy and happiness in her. To me, she's a character that kind of most evolves, changes during the course of the film, from dead to becoming alive at the end with the birth of the baby.
Yeah, agree.
Thank you. So Iris, Risa, Arlene, Susie.
So just briefly, no one has used this expression this evening, and I find it interesting. I I have a fair amount of acquaintances who are Holocaust survivors or the children of Holocaust survivors, and the one word, a term that they use a lot, and I think Ron Silver is a perfect example, is of survivor's guilt. I think he feels so guilty for surviving all of this that he is the most confused character. Women are more resilient in this film, but he is just lost. And I think it's because of the guilt that he feels. Leave it at that. I thought he did a great job.
I'm glad you brought that up. The others have regrets, but did nothing wrong, whereas he hid in the hayloft and got away, whereas he thinks his wife and children were killed. So that's certainly survivor's guilt. Who's next?
Next is Risa, then Arlene and Susie.
I'm glad you brought up the comedy part of it, because what was ringing in the back of my mind the whole time was, this is hysterical. This is a movie about a man who's got 3 wives. I mean, that in and of itself to me is kind of strange, don't you think? And also, if I'm not mistaken, Tamara made a reference to the fact that when they were married before the Holocaust, he was already off having affairs. This was a continuation of what his behavior was before the Holocaust. So he was already a murky character. And I thought the klezmer music, which I concentrated on more than whatever the other music was, every time that happened, it was telling a story of the joy that many Holocaust survivors, and Fern referred to this too, have when there's a simcha. It's a big deal. It's bigger than the simcha itself, because it is a simcha, and they appreciate it that way, and they're going to make the most of it. And I think it's great. I liked the story. I like Singer. I like his stories. I felt like the movie was longer than it needed to be.
Yeah.
So, by the end, I was like, okay, get on with it already. But it had an important story of post-Holocaust kind of stuff to happen. Yes, many survivors found out that their wife was still alive or their husband was still alive, and they were married again, and there were all kinds of problems with that. But I never heard of somebody with 3. So that was the humor for me.
Good.
My dad was on a train going from Poland searching for my mother. And he got on a train with a guy whose first wife came back after he married the second one. And he was on a train leaving both of them. He just was totally freaked out and had no idea what to do. And he just said he's on his way. He's leaving. It happened.
Yeah, it makes sense.
Arlene?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything very extraordinary to say, except that I thought that this film was terrific. The acting was terrific. Lena Olin was wonderful, not only Angelica Houston. And we haven't talked about, I am a second generation. My family came from the Ukraine area, and it came before the Holocaust. I don't know many people who are survivors. I know Fern and the children of survivors. But there was one scene in the film that was so wonderful, and that was the scene up in the Catskills.
Mm-hmm.
It was such a great scene, and it was so real.
Yeah.
I spent my summers as a girl in the Catskills and one bungalow colony after another. In the hotel is named like Kutcher's, was one of the big hotels in the Catskills. And the people there were all Jewish. They were free. They were happy. The music was wonderful. And the whole feeling that the film captured was the feeling that you got in those years when you were in the Catskills.
Arlene, I'm just reminded of something that we used to go to the Catskills also, and we would rent a bungalow that we shared with another family because we couldn't afford to get it ourselves. And the fathers would work in the city during the week and then come up to the country
Come up Friday
night. And it just reminds me of that kind of sexy sort of vibe that they had on Friday nights. We used to wait by the side of the road for the fathers to come up, and some of the parents were designated as the watchers, and they would take the kids and everybody to the casino that they showed there and have a show. And some of the couples got to go off to their kucha lanes, to their own bungalows, and be alone for a while. And they took turns doing that. And I remember my mother telling me that that's how they organized it, because they didn't have any other privacy.
That's right. And the times, I remember my father coming up every Friday with a watermelon and with the library books that I had ordered to read during the week. And he would then take them back to the library with and bring back the new list of books and the watermelon. And the mothers were all there, like so excited that the fathers were coming, that the men were coming. That was like one orgy after another for them, as far as I recall. They did entertainment in the casino. They put on shows. It was a time of celebration.
It was. As my mother said, you think you guys invented sex?
Right. So I wanted to chime in on that part.
Thank you very much. Lisa, did you?
Yeah, I just have to say the Catskills were not part of my growing up, but we went to the Nevele, those who remember the Nevele, which is 11 spelled backwards, and because it was started by 11 nuns who opened that casino, that hotel, and we honeymooned at the Nevele. And the other place that we did and watched the shows and everything was the funniest rabbinic convention I think we ever did was at the Grossingers. And the guys were like, I can't even tell you, it was before the time of women rabbis, but the guys were carrying on as if they were kids and enjoying being at Grossingers and laughing at the comedians, and the whole thing was years and years ago.
By the way, when my mother first came to the United States, which was in May of 1946, which was very early, she got a job at Grossinger's as a waitress. They wanted to hire her because she was one of the very early refugees, and she worked there for a summer, made a ton of money. She was quite pretty, and she wasn't thin. She had worked on this farm, and she looked fine, and she earned a bunch of money and took advantage of the fact that everybody felt terrible about her story, and she was kind of raking it in at the time.
She worked it.
Yeah, she worked it. Gail Shiner?
Well, and now that we brought all this up about sex, I mentioned that that Singer was very apt at describing women. He's also very apt at describing sex. And I think that if you should read a short story by him after you've seen this film, and you will, then maybe we can attribute it to the director, but I think we can also, we have to look at the author, because sex permeates everything. And Leah Olin was exactly how Singer would describe a woman. And I, as a Jewish woman, felt sort of good about this film and some of the things I've read by Singer, because often Jewish women are described as cold, distant, not sexual. Well, not with Singer, and not in this movie. We're sexy, and everyone's going to know that, even if Hollywood didn't hire us.
That's great.
How's that for a testimonial?
Great. Arlene Warchell, unmute yourself.
Yes, I really enjoyed this. I enjoyed this film immensely. Part of the reason being it was very nostalgic for me. Like you mentioned before about the Cookalames and going up to the country, and our fathers would come up on Friday night. But even more than that, I grew up in Coney Island.
No.
So it was, yeah. So it was very nostalgic. I was further down the boardwalk on 32nd Street, but I lived there for 14 years. So I just love seeing all the scenes on the boardwalk, and it was just wonderful. I love the film.
Good. Well,
Mitchell.
Yes. First off, I grew up in Philadelphia, and we could not afford to go to the Catskills. So we would go to Atlantic City for a day and change our clothes in the car. But I wanted to comment about Jadwiga, because I thought Mazursky went out of his way to present probably the only Gentile in the entire film, in, to me, a very positive way. And I really thought she did a hell of a job in becoming I guess the spine, if you could give him a spine, of Ron Silver and Herman, and even to the point where she maintained herself as the servant throughout the movie. And that poignant scene at the end where the baby started to cry, and Tamara went to get the apricot, and she has the apricot, and what does Jadwiga do? She turns the baby over to Tamara to feed the baby, because that was her role, to give it to her former boss. And I was just so impressed with her positive role.
Mm-hmm. Good. All right.
Beautiful.
Does anybody have anything else to say? If not, it's time to close it out.
Yeah. I'll just say one last thing.
Go ahead, Jeff.
I think it's interesting that the Catskills existed because of so much anti-Semitism that existed in the other areas where Jews were not allowed to go to during that period. And they started to decline once the degree of anti-Semitism in the United States declined, and Jews were able to visit other resort areas. And I guess I'm mentioning it because Ken Burns' documentary
Yes, thank you.
is coming out a week from tomorrow about America and the Holocaust. So
yeah, I haven't seen it yet, but I encourage everybody to see it, because he goes not shyly into the fact that the uptown German Jews despised the shtetl Jews from the Lower East Side. And there was this sub-tribalism at work. And I've mentioned this before, that Stephen S. Wise, who was FDR's friend, didn't want to make it into a Jewish war, and cautioned FDR in that direction to just hang back and just support the Brits financially. And of course, FDR didn't want to antagonize the anti-Semites or the Father Coughlins or anyone else by, FDR did see it as a moral crisis, but to name it as a Jewish war it would not be a big enough reason to get Americans enthusiastic about fighting and dying in it. And that will all be in the Holocaust documentary with Burns. And the period before World War II, there was an America First movement, and this guy, Father Coughlin, campaigned as an anti-Semite, and Uptown Jews said we should lay low at this time. And even the New York Times and the Oakes family buried the first news of the camp, inside the first section. It did not make the headlines of page 1 of the New York Times, the discovery of the camps. So
what will also be pointed out in the film is the degree of knowledge that was available about the Holocaust, including the camps of Treblinka, and Sobibor, that was being reported in the American newscasts.
So there was a lot of denial all the way up to the top because it was politically expedient. And so I'm certainly going to watch it. And if we want to make a night of it, it's 6 hours or 8 hours? Do you know, Jeff? It's over several nights.
Can you give us the name of it, Jim? The name of the documentary?
It's Ken Burns' Holocaust.
Ken Burns?
No, I think it's US and the Holocaust.
Okay.
It's on PBS, and I think it's 4 nights.
Okay, so it's probably 8 hours, and it starts next Sunday night. And it will be available to screen on PBS after that. They just keep running them. But it's the role of America before we entered the war was really quite damning, and quite, it's not talked about enough. It's really part of our history.
I agree.
So let's move forward. Yes.
Can I say something? Thank God for Lord Balfour, a British Jew. Thank God for him voting that vote to make Israel a nation.
He wasn't Jewish.
He wasn't?
No.
Oh, I thought he was.
No, in fact, he was anti-Semitic.
Anti-Semite.
Really?
The Balfour
Oh my God, I
Declaration.
don't know. I thought he was. Why would he?
No,
I didn't know
he did the
that.
opposite.
I'm sorry, I made a mistake.
He authored the white paper, I believe, that prevented Jews
Oh.
from creating the Palestine.
Oh my God.
Okay.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
I have to read that.
So the films that I'm considering coming up, there's one that I thought was a great premise called The Other Son. And it's a very Shakespearean story, and one that Hollywood has embraced. What happens if a Palestinian newborn is switched at birth with a Jewish Israeli newborn?
Okay.
Right. And nobody knows until 18 years later, when there are other siblings, and the families, love the other side, as their own without knowing it. It's a fascinating premise. Not the greatest film in the world, but I kind of like to show that because it's brave. The other one is a fascinating film called After the Wedding, directed by Suzanne Bier in 2019. And it's a strange story of an NGO worker in Africa who's is being summoned to France, and a wealthy businessman throws a lot of money at him, but he has to live in Paris and only supervise the work that's being done in Africa. And it's kind of a mystery until you find out that it's this great act of humanity. But I'm not going to ruin it. So I was impressed by that. Suzanne Bier there's another film she did, but I think this is the best. And so one of those will come up. Michael Clayton, starring George Clooney, is a powerful political and crime thriller. Not particularly Jewish, justice is served at the end, but it's a fun film. And then there's a film that I have loved called Mickey 1. I think Steve Greenberg saw it many times at college, or once here in LA when our friend Bob Gitt showed a restored version at UCLA, directed by Arthur Penn, which is Sean Penn's uncle, of Jewish extraction, and stars a very young Warren Beatty, who's always looking over his shoulder for the mob to come get him. And it's about the absence of God's word in our lives. And if you look at it as this religious parable about faith, I think it becomes a fascinating film. And more to come. If you want to see a film called Murina, it's on Kino. It's a mother-daughter story with a bad husband and a boyfriend who comes to visit on a Greek island. That's high on my list. And there's a a Holocaust film called The Forger that'll be out in January. Do you all remember Capernaum, directed by Christine Labaki, the Lebanese film about a young boy on the run from his family, and he sort of becomes the caretaker to a 2-year-old. The director of that film acts in a film called Costa Brava, Lebanon, shot in Lebanon, and it's getting very good notices. So it's not quite available yet. I'm going to look at that for us. But do see the Holocaust documentary by Ken Burns, and feed me some ideas if you've seen films that you love. I'm watching a lot of Paul Newman.
This Sunday night, we'll try to remember to see the Ken Burns.
Yeah, it'll be rerun. It'll be on there for months.
Jim, are we meeting in 2 weeks?
No, we're not. October 10th, 4 weeks.
Okay.
Because of the holidays, the clergy has decided that we should lay off, and that's fine. That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Ruxin.
Well, thank you all. I'm glad so many people really like this film, even if Frank didn't like the music. I think he liked other parts of it.
I have lots to learn before I
You're
speak.
muted, Frank.
Sorry.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you.
Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Enthusiasm.
Thanks, everyone.
Night.
Nice to see you all.
Happy
Bye.
holidays.
Hi, Arlene and Art. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, good.
Bye, Susie.
Bye.
Love you.
Good night,
Learn
bye, everyone.
I assumed more people loved Israel, but I guess I do.
Leave us down here.
Where am I?
What should I do? Just leave it be?
Leave.
Just exit. I think you just.
Nice. Well, all right.